The Microsoft employees at the time when there were immigrants coming in from Mexico into the southern borders of the US, the kids were being separated from their families using a Microsoft platform. And the employees said, not in my name. I don't want to work in a company that is doing this, that is separating kids from their families. And one person wrote a letter and got 100 others to sign it. And it was kind of ignored, I think, by the CEO until it got to about 4,000 or so of the employees were signing this petition. That's 4,000 out of 100, and I think at the time about 115,000 in Microsoft itself is a relatively small number, but enough people to actually make Microsoft cancel that contract with the US government immigration service and stipulate that every future contract needed to have human rights. That kind of idea of one person to 100 to a few thousand is incredible. Tails can wag dogs.
Do you want to go back to normal after Corona? Do you really want to go back to normal? I don't. Welcome to Not Back to Normal. I am Marcus Drön, and I want COVID-19 to change the business world for the better. In each episode, I talk to entrepreneurs, business leaders, and change makers about how they have adapted in this crisis and how they further intend to change the way they live, work, and run their businesses for the better to make capitalism much more conscious and working for all. In this episode, I'm speaking with Gib Bullock. Gib is the founder of the Craigberoch business decelerator. Yes, a decelerator, not another accelerator, which is what the world needs after the big corona-induced reset of 2020. As Gib will tell you, this decelerator, which takes place virtually at the moment, and on the Island of Bute when social distancing restrictions are lifted, is what wants to emerge, even if he goes bankrupt in the process of it. Yes, we talk about money, personal purpose or vocation, the rise of a new generation of intrapreneurs and employee activists, the corporate rat race, and how to get out of it. Whilst we didn't intentionally discuss his 2018 book, The Intrapreneur, Confessions of a Corporate Insurgent, certain tenets like the emergence of a fourth sector do provide a helpful container for our conversation. Looking back on this recording, which took place in August 2020, I now realize how dualistic my thinking often is. So thanks, Gib, for the challenge. We talk about former corporate lifestyles, how much money one needs, and how we were lucky enough to use the lockdown to slow further down and to do more yoga, more meditation. And I'd like just to say that I'm aware that not everyone is in such a safe and choice-creating situation. I'll come back to this point at the end of this episode, and now I'll bring you Gib Bullock. Gib, welcome on the podcast.
Great to be here, Marcus.
So this podcast is called Not Back to Normal, and I would like to start with a quote on what normal is and then just hear how it resonates with you. So, there are no norms. All people are exceptions to a rule that doesn't exist. What comes up?
It definitely resonates. I would agree there is no normal. I've been avoiding being normal most of my career and most of my life and feeling not normal. And that's a common red thread, I suppose. So yes, there is no normal. We are living some kind of consensus reality based on dogma, based on the supposed rules of the game. And I think at the moment where it's an opportunity to really unlearn a lot of these things and co-create, if you will, a new normal.
Yeah. So there are different directions we could take this now. I'd just like to throw another quote at you. Normality is the great neurosis of civilization. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think we are all somewhat paranoid that we need to conform to this abstract notion of normality and fit in. We are kind of herd creatures in some way. And I think that really stifles so much about our essence as human beings, our individual essence as a sort of mosaic of different characters. We're not all the same colour on the mosaic. What a boring mosaic that would be if we were all the same colour.
We are now in August 2020. The lockdown is more or less over, also in Scotland, I suppose, and in Switzerland, where you are normally based. Yeah, this was an interesting and a very exciting and challenging time for most of us to go into the lockdown, where lots of rules were suspended. A lot of people call it the big reset. And I'd like to know from you, if you go back pre-COVID, so take us back to like January, February, March 2020, and you consider your old normal, the life that you had, what parts did you like and what parts would you actually want to have back in case they haven't been able to be brought back?
On a personal level, I was enjoying my life. I was doing reasonably well in the old normal, if you will. I was happy, contented. And there was a lot of blind spots. I was getting on a plane most weeks, I would say, traveling a lot, busy, too busy, fitting a lot in, cramming a lot in to a full and what I felt was an interesting life. And yeah, there's elements of that I would mourn. I mean, I like variety. I always have. Going to interesting countries, meeting interesting people is great fun. Socializing with friends or being able to go out and see people in person is something I enjoyed, and I got a lot of energy out of that. But when you stop, we were all forced to stop, decelerate, if you will, then you look back and you see some of the pace was fairly crazy. And was it really necessary to get on all these planes for this meeting and that meeting? Was there certain things when you're forced to say no to things because no one can do anything? Would you in the past have said yes to that same thing, and where would it have taken you? And was it worth the energy? There's a lot I mourn, but there's so much that I am happy to let go
of. Fascinating. I'm quite curious about this paradox almost, or dichotomy, that you had already started the decelerator project. How did that feel actually? Did you notice that, or did you actually only really notice that in lockdown, that there was perhaps a little element of paradox or even crazy in that equation?
Yeah, I mean, we are all, what is it? It's an old adage about the plumber is the person who has the leaking taps and things like that. I can be an advocate for deceleration. I was realizing that the words and the deeds or the behaviors were not always aligned. What I think I had was a greater consciousness to a certain extent of that. We haven't talked about the previous incarnation of my career. We'll maybe come to that later on in the podcast, where really it was a different order of magnitude of travel and pace and work and working hours. I had already, with deceleration, realized that was unsustainable. I think the big difference was the travel, not being able to travel on planes. And the time that takes and the emotional drain that can have on you when you're always planning and going from one thing to the next and moving through lounges and security things and overnight stays away and things when you're in the same place, in the same bed physically every night. So yes, I am the first to admit we're always sometimes guilty of not being fully in alignment.
I'm in the same boat, Gib. I was traveling probably 3 times a month. I then actually scaled it back last year, but nevertheless, I was traveling a lot. And then lockdown came and I was just in my own bed with my girlfriend for 100 days in one stretch. And it was actually the best time of my life. And then I've been back flying to Germany twice. There was one specific trip that really, really challenged me at the core of who I currently have become, or the person that I am becoming, or what's emerging. And that obviously has to do with the name of the podcast, Not Back to Normal. I was basically asking myself, what are you doing? You're flying back to Germany for a half an hour workshop with a client on a Friday. And then the next workshop with another client in Munich, which is pretty much another flight or a 5.5 hour train, is on the Wednesday, actually. I found it really hard to make a decision on whether to stay the weekend and do a few other bits and bobs or actually fly back. So in the end, I decided to stay in Germany, but being away from home, being away from my girlfriend has really, really challenged me in my core in a way that I didn't expect, actually, because in my previous life, that was just normal. Yeah, that's what you do. That comes with the territory of being a change catalyst and an executive coach. So I really, really noticed that difference. And I'd like to ping it back to you. So assuming that you have had some travel, you're in Scotland, So in lockdown, I remember you were in Switzerland. What do you notice in the way that you now approach planning your calendar, accepting invites and so forth?
So the fact that I'm in Scotland this week is quite an anomaly. I travelled for the first time 2 days ago, let's say early August, second week in August, for the first time in 6 months, literally, getting on a plane. And, just as an aside, it was a very interesting and very different experience from the experience I normally have. I live in Geneva, and I was going through Geneva Airport, which is normally very busy with maybe a dozen security lines, which were all closed over. And even walking, people know that you go through a train station in Geneva that's in the airport, and normally you're walking past huge billboards of adverts for iPhones normally and something else, huge pictures all the way down the walls. It's a gauntlet of these things, a gauntlet of Geneva, luxury goods and watches and wealth managers, all gone, because there isn't the footfall now through the airport to justify. So they've taken them down. So the walls are kind of bare. And it was just such a wake-up call as to the slowdown that there has been in our economic system. Everything has a knock-on effect. And then you get on the plane and very different sort of distancing and things like that. To answer your question, the lockdown in Switzerland has been really lifted for quite a long time, and it was probably less severe than in some other parts of the world. I could go out, I could walk my dog with my partner, and we've been able to go to bars and restaurants at social distance for a long, long time. And really over the last 2 months, I've missed that feeling of abundance of time that there seemed to be during the full lockdown, when there was nothing in the calendar, when everything was suddenly cancelled, everything that was planned ahead, like most of us, I had to plan many months in advance, and all of that just went. And then there was this feeling of real abundance of time, space. There was nothing to plan in the evening because, unless it was a Zoom call with friends or whatever, because there was nothing to do or be done. And so the time you could have to perhaps meditate, and I've been pleased that I have managed to improve a meditation practice, start almost a new meditation practice, and have that as a legacy of the lockdown. A friend has been doing online yoga in the mornings. I've been doing that with her, and that has sustained. So some of these things that I felt, well, there isn't enough time for that. I would do it if I had more space. I've just made sure there is space and made sure they were priorities where they maybe weren't priorities before, or where I maybe told myself, if I do that, then I won't be able to do something else. And I also have become very interested in the concept of, it's a Japanese word that I came across in the context of art, actually, and it's called Ma, M-A. There's a little Japanese symbol for this concept. It's an intentional space. It's the space between the notes in music. In an art context, it's these Japanese paintings where you've got a big frame and perhaps all the paint is down in one corner or skewed to the side and there's a gap. It doesn't mean to say that they've got the frame the wrong size. It means to say there is deliberate, intentional space in there. And I'm trying to bring this into a business context and into my scheduling of my diary, where downtime is not just a space between meetings where you can catch up an email. It is nothing, intentional nothingness, the space full of possibilities, the Japanese would say, and build that and factor in nothingness into the day. And certainly in the previous life, there was no gaps. There were no space between the notes. And you could imagine what a symphony would sound like if it was just notes all crammed together.
Mm.
It's the space that almost makes the music and makes the difference between a virtuoso player of an instrument and someone who is just a computer, let's say, that's just following the notes.
Yeah, fascinating. A really good metaphor and a really good illustration that you gave with the music as well. So one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the podcast for my listeners is because when we met last year at the Business Fights Poverty Oxford conference, I was quite struck by exactly that intentionality that you have and the way you design your life and the way you I guess, live, love and work. Also your backstory, that you were never a normal guy. I kind of thought, wow, that's really inspiring and really needed, because let's just call him Michael again. So in the last podcast episode, I started to create a persona, amalgamated chief executive called Michael. And I'd like you to take us back to these parts in your career, probably in the early 2000s, where your life must have looked very, very different. It must have felt very, very different. I'd like to hear about the success, but I'd also like to hear about perhaps the pitfalls and the struggles that then later led through various breakthroughs and various innovations. And eventually that led up to the decelerator, which is what you're doing right now.
I will keep it very brief, and you can drill into the bits that might be of more interest to your listeners. Everything is relative in these things. When you join, when I joined Accenture after working in a couple of different companies, I joined what was then called Anderson Consulting in 1996. You had to try and make partner. And then when you make partner, you realize you're at the bottom of another ladder. So everything is relative. I was not the most senior, not the most junior. And I had joined that firm having left an island in Scotland where I currently am, where I grew up, where my heart never left, I guess. But I went to the bright lights of London and followed this story of what normal, successful people would do and to earn money and have all these KPIs of success, a gold card in the luggage and that gold-plated idea. Then my first experience of deceleration and changing was I read about an opportunity to go and volunteer in the Balkans, use my skills in a different context. That was the missing link. That was the thing that hadn't been, I guess I would now, looking back, call it purpose, finding that kind of personal purpose. And it's a bit of a drug. I went there, I went to Northern Macedonia. That was just after the Kosovo crisis. And all that time was thinking, was there a way of creating not just an opportunity for people to go and volunteer their time as one-off beings, but to create a business model around this, a social enterprise within the wider Accenture. And that's what I came back and ended up doing for the next 14, 15 years, pushing water uphill, being the crazy one, the abnormal one. I came back saying, well, if I had been working as a volunteer, I'd taken a 95% salary reduction. Maybe some of my colleagues would be interested in working for a lower salary if we could be doing interesting work and meaningful work and work that makes us feel we're making a difference. And of course, the consensus was that's crazy. Everyone believes and knows that the rules are you pay people more, they work harder, and you get better people. So we're flying in the face of that. Maybe we could work for organizations that couldn't normally afford high-end consulting. Maybe we could work for the charities, the NGOs, the UNICEFs to save the children. If we could get the price point down and if we could not make profit on the work. Well, charities, everyone knows they accept free consulting. They don't pay for it. So challenging that. Everyone knows Accenture won't work for non-profit, but they did. So it was kind of really flying in the face, pushing water uphill for a period of time. And against the odds, this thing did work. And so I had the best job. I loved what I was doing. I was, from a standing start, we worked in about 80 countries around the world as this social enterprise, this guerrilla movement within Accenture, provided about $250 million worth of services around the world. So it was really challenging these norms. And there was a lot of luck involved in this and a great team of people that I was working with. This was not a one-man band thing. It went super well until late 2014, when I would say there was a big disruption.
And how does the book fit in? The Intrapreneur, Confessions of a Corporate Insurgent. That's just really, really triggering all sorts of very interesting associations. So what's in the title? What is a corporate insurgent? And why did you write the book?
Well, I hadn't intended to write a book. And this pivot that I've just talked to you about was the catalyst for doing this. It created the element to the story that I wanted to write. I had been working and swimming against the tide to a certain extent, trying to say that there was a different kind of business possible, that purpose could be at the heart of business, that this one-dimensional focus on profit in the shortest possible time, I think the blinkers were so narrow and so tight on businesses and business leaders that we needed to think more broadly. And here was a guerrilla movement, if you will, an insurgency within Accenture, which wasn't making profit. It was covering its costs. It was a neutral, I prefer to say not for loss business rather than not for profit business. The business case was we were attracting and retaining the best people in Accenture. People were queuing up. Today there's over 50,000 people.
Wow.
On the waiting list around the world to work on a lower salary. It's not always half salary now. They might be working in a developed country, in New York or London or Oxford at the headquarters of where we met, at the headquarters of Oxfam. But they will give up something. And Accenture's still not making profit from the work. And then I find myself, again, I think partly by working just too hard and at a pace that was unsustainable, which is back to what we talked about earlier on, I found myself having burnout or breakdown or whatever we want to call it, and spending 5 days, 5 nights in a psychiatric hospital in Scotland. I was back in Scotland visiting. I got held into this hospital. And so part of the reason for writing the book was to speak up as I am today and as I do whenever anyone gives me the opportunity to talk about mental health, to break the taboo that there is around mental health, but more to challenge the notion that it's more challenging the mental health of the system. Here was me trying to do something that I'd been told was crazy. And had they been right, had the people that said you were crazy, that business shouldn't do these things, that, it will never work, were they vindicated? Here I end up in this place where, quote unquote, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but, we put our crazy people in society. Mm. The book is set in the context of being in this place. The chapters and the sections are set out as the 5 days, reflecting on the outside world from a psychiatric ward. The outside world at the moment looks a bit crazy when you're inside. So the lunatics may have taken over the asylum, but they've probably taken over the boardroom as well, in my view. And so it's really holding a mirror up to the system throughout the book and saying, did I go crazy, or is it the system that I've been fighting to try and change? Is the endemic burnout, disengagement, deep anxiety in business, the unhappiness that there is across business, is that a failure of the individuals to adapt, or that I wasn't resilient enough, or I couldn't cut it? Is that kind of behavior a perfectly normal response of normal, healthy individuals to a system that is crazy? Hmm. We talk about the mental health of individuals. We don't talk about the mental health of organizations. So I'm making the premise through the book and through a story, and it's a story that talks about ups and downs and goods and bads, and it's really trying to hold a mirror up to the system and poke fun at the old system and the craziness of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point of view that you have, that it's not just individual mental health, but organizational health, which is why I think it was one of the big McKinsey IPs or platforms that I think was floating around probably around the time that you actually were writing the book. In your point of view and in your experience, what is the core problem of big companies nowadays? Why do they create so many unhappy executives, so many unhappy Michaels, that amalgamated persona that I actually have worked with? And even at that level, they're not like the CEO of a global Fortune 500 company, but they're typically a country head or the chief marketing officer or something. They're like usually in the top 50 of a global mega corporation. And very often they say, yeah, but Marcus, I have no choice. I have no choice. I have to do this because X, Y, Z. These people are making 1-2 million in salary. And, as you said earlier, live this gold-plated lifestyle. And yet they feel absolutely helpless. It's this learned helplessness that I'm hearing in their stories. I'm also hearing a lot of numbing devices, as in they anesthetize themselves with whatever. And your story actually is a really powerful one of breaking through, going through that struggle and asking yourself the question, why am I doing this? And is this just me, or is this just the system? So yeah, what's your view on the system? And coming back to the original question, what is the core problem of big companies nowadays?
I think the underlying issue boils down to our relationship with money. And this is something I've been looking a lot at recently. Money is the last great taboo. People will talk to you about their personal lives, their sex lives, before they'll talk to you about how much money they've got in the bank or their salaries and things. It's a great taboo. And it's the place where we hide all our unconscious projections in some way. And we are programmed from a very early age, and it's particularly heightened in business, that money and pursuit of money will give us freedom, will give us happiness, will give us whatever. That's the KPI, the measure of success individually. And of course, with big corporations, to your point, it is short-term profit maximization. All of my career, and since before I got into work, this has been the mantra, but really over the last 3 decades, it's dominating everything else within business, is this short-term profit. The incentive mechanisms for the leaders in business are all around that share price. So better to do share buybacks rather than invest in innovation or creativity or people, for that matter, the people who create the profit. It's all about financial engineering to a certain extent and control. And the CEOs, certainly I'd say, of the Fortune 500, maybe more so than the smaller organizations you're talking about, they're almost masquerading as COOs. They're almost, it's minimize risk, maximize the numbers, have a smooth quarterly earnings thing. And it just stifles creativity, innovation. And it's also, as they're finding out, burning out and frying and disengaging the very people. We then get onto this hamster wheel whereby from the top down, we've got to be keeping this thing whirring along. Our own individual pursuit of money is linked in with the share price, is linked in with keeping things going. And we can't get off the hamster wheel very easily until, of course, the great reset, the great pandemic has suddenly challenged that whole narrative. So ultimately, short-term focus on profit, but with a deeper, I think, psychological relationship to money, I think is at the heart of this.
And what did you learn about the relationship to money when you led the Accenture development partnership with regards to those 50,000 people that clearly wanted to work for it, work for the platform, work for its quest and its aim and ambition? Because clearly that was a not for loss, as you describe it. So the rules were changed. And were there any different leadership behaviors of, let's say, quite senior people that you noticed?
The normal paradigm, and I was part of this, is I will work hard to earn as much money as possible. And when I have enough money, quote unquote, I will stop doing that and do what makes my heart sing, what I always wanted to do. I will follow my purpose. And of course, that is analogous to chasing the gold at the end of the rainbow. You define enough at one point, and by the time you get to, $1 less than enough, you realize that enough becomes, you add a zero to it, and you're always caught. And I think we're all in this trap. And I found myself in this environment where everything had slowed down, where I was in this northern Macedonia, where people had no money and they had to think about other things, where I found myself seeing new ways of using my skills in a different way. And I was, I found myself much more motivated and found much more pleasure from things that didn't involve paying. The London lifestyle in the late 90s was all about, a good night out was X amount of money and you had to go on a very expensive holiday. Everything had a big price tag. And I realized that pleasure and enjoyment and fulfillment in life didn't necessarily have to have a price tag attached. Yeah, they're coming back into the business and realizing that a lot of people discovered that too, that the less I worried about making money and chasing money, actually it started looking after itself. I started to get promoted in the firm and worry less about money. I do think when you ask the question on the senior leaders, I have a view that in business, and this is not universal to everyone, there are exceptions that prove the rule, but I do believe that the people at the most senior levels in business are so invested in the old system. They have got to the top. They have become successful in a system that is, I think, fundamentally broken. And it is based around getting them the money and the lifestyle that has got them to the top. They will have huge cars, second homes, third homes, amazing lifestyles, but in many cases are deeply unhappy. In some cases, deeply unhealthy, but they have more money in the bank than they could ever have dreamt of. And yet they are, again, through this, I think you mentioned this anesthetic. The anesthetic is to keep working as hard as possible and to keep earning more money on top of having more money than you could ever spend. And that's the anesthetic, and that's the difficulty. So I have the view, and I talk about this in the book, that there's almost a temperature inversion you talk about, that the people lower down the organizations, I think, call it the millennials. I know everyone labels the millennials with everything, but I think there is the level of affinity towards the new agenda is inversely proportionate to the level of seniority in today's firms. And that leadership, when it comes to changing the system, may actually come bottom up or from other parts of the organization than the top down. I don't see, with a few exceptions, I don't see that the leadership is there to change the system, and all the incentive mechanisms are there to keep the system the way it is. So the onus really, I think, is having to go on the people who are 20 years younger than me.
And that resonates very strongly with some of the work I've been involved with in the last few years. Lots of bottom-up leadership programs that were really more sort of like in-house, or let's say young talent as in-house consultants, I would actually call it. There was NWOW with a big energy company, which stands for New Way of Working. And it was very much a capability building program with the aim to eventually find the money savings yourself and, not by McKinsey or Bain or Boston. Ultimately, that effort and the results that these people have produced will always hit the corporate immune system and the cultural autopilot, which is still controlled by the people you just described, the executives that sit on the boards and report to shareholders. How is this going to eventually be solved? Because I am very much fully in support of leadership at all levels and creating bottom-up movements. But how can they actually break through if the people at the top can always say, yeah, but we have to hit quarterly targets?
Well, I am very interested, and with the book being called The Intrapreneur, I'm obviously interested in intrapreneurship, and I'm also interested in employee activism, which is, I think, a close cousin, not the same. I think entrepreneurship is an individual or supported by a group or a team or a group of individuals innovating within the system, deciding I'm not going to leave and do the startup, which of course is the sexy thing to do, and we go out and do a startup and many of them fulfill, but to say, if I can stay in the system and create the next M-Pesa mobile banking app, that was a great story, probably the best story of entrepreneurship, then I'm in a pre-scaled system. The problem with social enterprises is they lack scale. That's their Achilles heel. But if you want to get to scale, you start with scale, start with a super tanker and just try and change it in a very small degree in a different direction. And then I believe there is huge knock-on effect. And the role there in leadership, I think for leadership, is to see that there is a huge untapped potential for their people to innovate and create things like M-Pesa. If we can get leadership to understand that the social and environmental challenges that we face as a society, from climate change, yes, to how we feed and nourish the next billion on the planet, how we provide them with access to healthcare, to water, to sanitation, to education, to energy. You could call these the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or you can call them a mouth-watering, untapped opportunity for business to innovate around these things. So for leaders like CEO of Novartis talks about unbossing the company. So he gets it. He's going to empower and inspire and engage employees to create these new business models as entrepreneurs. So that's one aspect as the entrepreneur. Employee activism, I think, is a very interesting close relation, and that's more the collective and the realizing in a pyramidal, the normal hierarchical organization where there's far more people lower down the organization than obviously at the top. Through sheer force of numbers, we can change strategy, we can change policy. One of the best examples of this, a lot of it is coming from Silicon Valley, but I don't think it will stop there. The Microsoft employees at the time when there were the immigrants coming in from Mexico into the southern borders of the US, the kids were being separated from their families using a Microsoft platform. And the employees said, not in my name. I don't want to work in a company that is doing this, that is separating kids from their families. And one person, I guess, wrote a letter and got 100 others to sign it. And it was kind of ignored, I think, by the CEO until it got to about 4,000 or so of the employees were signing this petition. That's 4,000 out of 100, and I think at the time about 115,000 in Microsoft itself is a relatively small number, but enough people to actually make Microsoft cancel that contract with the US government immigration service and stipulate that every future contract needed to have human rights. That kind of idea of one person to 100 to a few thousand is incredible. Tails can wag dogs. Google employees went on strike when their senior bosses who had been guilty of fairly shabby behavior were getting big payoffs. No, that's not right. So I think we're only beginning to see the start, and I have huge optimism that employee activism will start to see that through the sheer force of numbers, we can change strategies of companies. We can change companies bottom up.
That's a really powerful story that you've shared. And that gets us to capitalism. I'd like to garner your views on when you hear the word capitalist, does that resonate with who you are? Do you consider yourself a capitalist?
To a certain extent, yes, I am a capitalist. Yes, I am. But a different kind of capitalist, I would like to think. There's so many flavors. We think capitalism is this one big amorphous thing. Capitalism in Japan is very different from capitalism in North America, is very different from capitalism in Sweden. So yes, I am a capitalist.
Yes, and I am a capitalist as well. And this is a question that has been bugging me ever since I started the podcast, because this is my wish for us, for humanity, for the world. I want COVID-19, the lockdown, the big reset to really, really make us think about this thing, capitalism, because this is one of the biggest forces. It's almost like we created this. It's not a natural force, but it's an extension of us. It's part of our culture, and it guides so many things, as you earlier described, this pursuit of money and shareholder wealth and quarterly results. And I work in change. I'm a change catalyst, and change starts with you and in the here and now. And for me, these two things, capitalism and capitalist, there's not that much out there, actually. I'm missing a bit of narrative as to, okay, so I'm a capitalist. Ooh, that's a really, really, really negatively connotated word. Ooh, I don't like to be a capitalist. But hey, what is the alternative? As far as I know, there are two main eco-political systems that we came up with, and one is called socialism, with permutations in communism and some other areas, and capitalism. Now, I think, this is my personal point of view, that socialism has just failed flat out. We've had so many experiments with it, most recently in Bolivia with Evo Morales, which was a peasant from the mountains. And that's what he was probably the best candidate socialism ever had to prove that it can work. And even he, I don't know the details, but seemed to have eventually gone down the road of, becoming a, whatever you want to call it, benevolent dictator. So capitalism also has fantastic manifestations, for instance, in Denmark, in Sweden. Germany in the 60s and 70s was a real socially oriented capitalist system. As you said, it's a very broad label, and I would like to now hone in on two specific connotations that I think would be quite helpful to give capitalism a better reputation and actually to change it from within. And I think this very much resonates with what you call employee activism, and that is the conscious capitalist. What does that term or name or label bring up in you in terms of how does it resonate with you?
I think conscious can be applied to many different terms, to improve many different terms. We're hearing a lot about conscious leadership as well. And I think conscious capitalist, it's knowing when to be a capitalist and when to be a socialist. Again, I resist this binary thinking. Mm-hmm. I think we have to go into this non-binary or a different kind of paradigm around this between socialism hasn't worked, therefore it's capitalism. Later on in the book, I start to fly kites around how business could operate. I talk about the notion of a fourth sector. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's probably capitalist in inverted commas, but it is a new business ecosystem where purpose is the primary driver, where we have a marketplace for outcomes that take the DNA of some of the other three sectors, if you will, the best DNA of business. And there's a lot that business does and capitalism does around innovation and scale and creativity that's great. But there's also an awful lot that the public sector does that's good. We've seen the role that governments can play in this current crisis to support the private sector. We're seeing this unparalleled interventions, if you will, by the government sector into what was paradigm. We're slaying a lot of sacred cows there. And then the non-profit sector, the development sector, the charity sector has an awful lot that we can learn. So this notion of a fourth sector is a hybrid. And I think we need to think in hybrids. And I feel that I am individually a hybrid. On some days, yes, I would come across as a capitalist, and some days I will come across as a socialist, and some days as something else. So let's get away from the binary labels and let's co-create something that is qualitatively different from what we've got at the moment, but that can not throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we can use the best of what we've already got and apply it in a different context.
And could you tell us a little bit more about the marketplace for outcomes? What's behind that, and what are the early examples that work?
It's more emergent than I could say, point to lots of examples that we've done in the past. And as I say, it's flying some kites. But I take education. I give an example of the education sector, which has traditionally been public, with a few elites getting educated in private schools. And in some parts of the world, anywhere in the world, if you have enough money, you will get a good education if you're the top 5% or 10%. How do we make access to quality education a human right for all, irrespective of how much money your parents have to have? And that can be around the world. And I use the example in the book of an Indian child, a girl born tomorrow in India. What is the difference between that child being a productive economic citizen in 20 years' time, a teacher, a doctor, a person that works in a company like Accenture, where I worked, or being, heaven forbid, and too many are, a child mortality statistic or a child bride or dropping out of school? What are the interventions we need to make in that system? How do we create an ecosystem? The UN would say it's about X number of teachers and Y number of schools, and it will cost Z. We tend to see education as this silo, whereas, of course, it's a mix between health, education, nutrition in the first few months of life to help brains develop fully. We need vaccines. We need, yes, schools and education, but there will be a technology component to that, of course. And I did some work on, we need to keep that girl in school, stop her from getting married, provide sanitary products and facilities in the school so that she doesn't drop out when she reaches puberty for a week every month, all sorts of things to get to that 20-year thing. And we looked at an economic lens. And if you give me $1 when the child is born, that $1 would actually be worth 53 if the child made it to the workplace. So there is a huge economic future value. And how can we use the fancy financial instruments that we have at the moment, whether it's social impact bonds, or I was looking at other types of financial instruments, to create a marketplace to incentivize, to bring that future economic value to a marketplace for outcomes today, where all of these interventions that I've described could be done in different ways by different organizations. A marketplace whereby the successful organizations, be these social enterprises, be the NGOs, be the large businesses, could come in and make interventions that would help us get to that end goal, rather than a project in a silo doing its own thing and another project in a silo doing its own thing. That's where I think we can do a whole lot more to create these kind of new, vibrant ecosystems that are rewarding outcomes towards these kind of common goals, and get it away from the silo mentality and the project mentality and the pilot mentality. And that's a very different thing. I am sector agnostic as to who is involved in getting that to that outcome. But the outcome should drive it, not who's going to make the most profit in the short term next quarter.
I find that really interesting that you actually brought in a very impressive KPI. I mean, a 50x return is something that any good venture capitalist, even in Silicon Valley, would consider an outrageous success. Yet, I would be quite interested to hear from them. I even know a few people in that sector and also over there, whether they would even be interested to work in the emerging fourth sector, do what you did and others did, to work for a lot less money in the short term in order to create a system that delivers all the outcomes. And I really like the analogy that you gave, on this one girl in India, and at the same time, in 20 years' time, could reap the economic benefits and the returns for investors that they are currently used to. So when I listened to you, I thought, that's really possible, but how do we get there? How do we get people to change their perspectives, get out of that rat race, get out of that trap that they're in, which is what we talked about earlier, these numbing devices, the speed, the money, the hotels, the restaurants and everything. How do we get them to their own inflection point so that they realize, hey, I could actually do that? Because, quoting another great Japanese model, ikigai, your reason for being, I would say that anyone has obviously their ikigai. And I would say that if you give any corporate executive 1 week, for example, in your decelerator, to really, really think what they're here to do. The two most important days of your life is the day you're born and the day you figure out why you were born. So slightly segueing also into the decelerator project, how can we get these people away from these jobs and focusing on outcomes and returns at the same time in the long run?
I would first of all challenge that it's not necessarily all about us all cutting our salaries and doing this on a non-profit basis and things. What I've described is actually a way that we can actually almost do a judo move on the system and change this. And there is a return on investing, whether it's for government, society, for corporations, in investing in that Indian girl. And there's by the way, I talk about it in the book, but in layman's terms, but there is a piece of work that I did with Brookings on exactly that topic, and maybe you share it in the course notes or something. And there's also papers that I've written around this fourth sector, technical papers that probably very few people would read. I tried to rehash these in more acceptable terms, like comparing how Elon Musk would run the UN versus the current UNs. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do without money. It is a change in our attitudes. So to come to your question, the realization I had when I wrote the book is about the power of business to change the world. I still believe that. The power of the individual, whatever level or label or title they have in business, to change business. The realization over the few years of writing the book and since that 2014 burnout, the realization is it starts with ourselves. That if we want to have that cascading change, we have to fundamentally start with ourselves. And if we can change ourselves, we can probably then change business that will change the world. And that's where this deceleration thing comes in. If we are just so busy with our heads down, doing, busyness, not business, but busyness, just being very busy and feeling that is making us efficient or effective or successful or bringing money, rather than suddenly slowing that drumbeat down to where we have to reflect inwards, face up to some of our unconscious biases or projections, and really understand what our true essence is and what we were here maybe born to create. When we've taken off the anesthetic of just being busy 70 hours a week. And my hope with deceleration is it's not just about slowing people down. That's the first part of it. It is then exposing them to the kind of creative powers of nature, of the arts, of things like improv theatre, of community, really trying to kind of stimulate people so that they will then not sit and meditate for the rest of their life, do nothing. That's not what deceleration is about. It is then to move forward from a more conscious state of leadership, to create consciously rather than doing unconsciously.
Yeah, and it really resonates with what I often get involved with is working with agility. You have to slow down before you speed up. I've been on a journey in the last 2 years where I had ups and downs and also accelerations and decelerations. And then the lockdown just gave me personally a unique opportunity to almost do it in its purest form. I mean, my morning routine, containing yoga, meditation, breath work, personal journaling, positive affirmations, that almost extended to 3 hours. And then on top of that, my girlfriend and I did walks for about an hour and a half. So, I mean, almost half our waking time. Perhaps not what you described earlier, like doing nothing, but it was really not work, and it was really not driven by anything. It was just being rather than doing. And the big insight I gained, and it's not just an intellectual insight, it's an embodiment. I feel it, is that, there's this law in quantum physics that says something like you can only either exactly locate where a particle is, but not its speed or direction, or you can absolutely, with 100% precision, measure the direction or the speed of that particle, but not where it is. I think it's the unfuzzy logic. And this is what I experienced, because when you actually slow down, you start to see different things that you have never seen before. You start to ask yourself questions that you've asked yourself never before. And then when you go back to some shape of or some form of normality, you actually notice that you have updated your software in a really, really profound way. And that I can't say yes to a few things anymore that I said yes to previously because I couldn't look in the mirror more. It's like, how could I be authentic and earnest and serious if I kept telling the world a story and then the felt experience is actually different? And because I'm now so much more aware, it's actually painful. I can't gloss over that. And especially the speed, I think, is one of the fantastic numbing devices, this 70, 80 hours, because you just don't have to, you don't have to time. And I think earlier you mentioned that, no, it's about making the time. So what I guess shifted at the level of self in the last 3-4 months, and I'm not quite there yet, but I think I made huge strides, is to move the inner voice, the inner story from blaming and shaming much more to claiming ownership. Really, really saying like, this is me, this is how I show up. And every morning, especially when I do my routine, I can hack myself and I can be the person that I want to be. And then linking this back to businesses, asking myself the question, do I want to work with the big global corporations that do exactly what we described earlier? Do I actually want to be part of that? Yes, depends on the case. But more so, I started to work with a lot more companies that are privately held. entrepreneurially led, privately held, not in that rat race. And I'd like to bring this back to the notion of capitalism and capitalist and the big mental health issues in companies. And I'd like to garner your views on, do you see any differences in these global corporations that are listed on the stock market and companies that are privately held?
Yes, in some cases. I used to, before I worked in Accenture, I worked in Mars, which is one of the largest private manufacturing companies in the world, owned by a family. And there are some big family businesses or small family businesses. And I guess you could say, and certainly Mars is doing some great work on this, they can take a very long-term view. They maybe don't have this drumbeat of the quarterly earnings to think about. In quarterly earnings, I think, we need to stop that sometime pretty quickly. I think there's a realization that that's just crazy, even in the listed companies. So yes, long-termism is possible, but it very much depends on the owners of that business and the level of consciousness of these owners. So I don't think it's a panacea by any manner of means. And again, I don't want to go into this binary thinking of, big publicly owned companies bad, privately owned good. It depends very much. And I think we, again, have to sort of rethink the system of what we're doing and what we're doing within it. And until we fundamentally think about that at an individual level and a collective level, we won't crack it. To go to your point of the routine that you've discovered and the 3 hours of preparing and meditating and yoga and getting to your true essence, I think that's fabulous. I maybe don't do quite as much as that. Maybe I should do more. If I've got a bit of meditation and I might take a while over breakfast and start off with some yoga in the morning or go for a long walk with the dog, there's still that little voice from the deep programming over several decades in business that says you are not being productive, you are wasting your time, you are lazy, you are not maximizing something, right? Probably with money in mind. I'd imagine the Dalai Lama spends a lot more time even than you meditating in the day, or certainly than me. Is anyone calling the Dalai Lama lazy or unproductive? Probably not. I don't think so, right? I think whatever he is doing, I have a lot of respect for what he says and what he does in the world. And yet we focus so much on this doing stuff. So I would question, I'd go back to you and say, when you weren't spending these 3 or 4 hours in your prep, what were you doing with that time? Was it productive time? Was it changing anything productively? Or was it so much, I think, in that 70 or 80 hours that is either unproductive time or doing something that just doesn't matter? And if we can cut out all that stuff, or is it the whole Tim Ferriss 4-hour working week? 4-hour working week, oh my God. How can you possibly say 4-hour working week? It's 40. Everyone knows it's 40. And 40 actually is what we get paid. We work 70, but he talked about a 4-hour working week. And there's something in that. I don't know what the right number of hours is. Some weeks it might be 4 hours and some weeks it might be a lot more. But if it's conscious hours, and if the time that I talked about before, the enabling space, the deliberate space between the notes is making each of these notes mean more in your life and in your career, then that mass space, that nothingness is just as important as the doing time.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I'm a micro business owner. So I've been self-employed for 6 years and I've started to bring in some people actually quite recently because I don't want to do all of this stuff by myself on my own. That helps already to work a little bit less. But the more profound insight and actually pain point that I found myself in a few years ago was that I'm an employee, I'm a director, and I'm a shareholder. And guess what, Gib? Who actually won at the end of a corporate year in my own business? It was the shareholder. The shareholder in me just said more. It wasn't unproductive. There perhaps were a few projects that I shouldn't have done because they were probably not that impactful and maybe not really what I'm about. But at the end of the day, the shareholder just said more. And so when I come at this whole quite challenging conversation around capitalism, capitalists, which is what I really, really want to drive forward, is I'm one of them and I know exactly how it functions. So I'm not saying any of these corporate executives are bad people. Most of them are good people. They just have bad incentives because I experienced that bad incentive in my own self. And so after slowing down, I have completely reset the KPIs, as you said earlier. I mean, you get done what you measure. So what do you measure? And why do you measure that? And from what level of consciousness do you measure that? I now have a KPI that says that this is the amount of money that I need to make to just break even. This is the amount of money that I need to not worry about money. And then this is the amount of money that I need to make in order to start saving and maybe go on 1 or 2 holidays. And out of a sudden, my whole life has changed because the stress, the pressure to deliver against that artificially set target is gone. And so I could actually have this lifestyle for the rest of my life. And so that does bring it also back to publicly listed companies, because the public companies, they really don't have a choice unless they delist, because this is just the way it is. It's the fiduciary responsibility of managers. Well, I don't have that. I can just basically cancel my meetings later on and say, I actually prioritize doing another walk. And as you said earlier, nothing really would happen.
But that's because you work for yourself, because whether we're working for ourselves in a micro business or our own bosses, or whether we're part of the, the bigger corporate system, part of the machine, it comes down to the individual choices that we make. A lot, again, relating to this thing money and our unconscious biases and projections around it, I think is pure. So you're saying I work out how much I need to do, and that dictates what I do and how much I work. I am trying and aspiring or advocating that people start from a different place. Money is the outcome, and your bank balance may go up or it may go down, but your starting position is, what is it that I want to do? What is it that wants to emerge through me, if you will? What is it that I feel I should be doing? Just taking one step at a time, one step ahead, to follow your purpose and get still enough to be in a space whereby this can emerge, taking away this noise of what I need to survive and how much my rent is and things, and do that. And you will probably survive. You will probably be okay. You will be here next year, the year after. None of us know whether we'll be here tomorrow, but your needs will be met in life, financially, but not only financially, in other ways as well. And the bank balance, my bank balance, I would imagine, to go down following this decelerator purpose is something I feel I can't not do. It is part of my essence. It is something I want to create. It's something, if you will, it's almost like a vocation in some way, without meaning that in a religious way. But the money and the resources and my bank balance will be an outcome of what I'm doing, not starting with how much have I got and how much I can afford to do. It's just probably flipping it 180 degrees, I think, in terms of the outlook.
Yeah, I've done my Ikigai work. I probably need to clarify and calibrate what I mean by how much money I need to get by and la-di-da. When I started my business, and also when I was an employee before, I had a certain lifestyle expectation, and I took jobs that came with a certain salary tag. And then later, when I started my own business, I took projects that came with a certain fee or an annual retainer in order to fund that lifestyle. So I succumbed my joy of working and what I'm really good at, saying no to things that are not me, to that outcome of having a big lifestyle, just like you described yours. And then throughout this period, I came a lot more closer to who I really am and what I have to offer. What is it actually that I'm really unique at or great at, rather than I can just do it? And so I've then shifted over the last 2-3 years more and more into only doing the projects that I really should be doing. And so in that context, I feel quite sorted, actually. And then what I have done is I have halved my cost base, actually a bit more even. I need to work 4 or 5 days a month, that to just give you a bit of calibration. So that's why it is an important question to me, actually, because it actually is a great de-stressor, and it's a decelerator almost built into my operating system, because I'm not saying, oh, there's a new client potential. Oh, I could take this job. It's like, do I really want this job? Is this job for me? Could I add really value to it? And I have created a few filter questions based on a book called Essentialism that was an epiphany for me. Like, just don't take a job because somebody says, I'll give you good money for it. And I define that the most important criteria for me to take on work now is, because I call myself a sparring partner, a change catalyst executive course. I'm a sparring partner for change. And that means that the leaders actually need to do the boxing, or stay with a different analogy. One client calls me a change choreographer. So that means they need to dance. And the question I ask them is, are you actually dancing? Do you want to dance? And if they say, maybe you could design that. No, you dance and I'm the choreographer. And if you don't want to do that, then I don't do the job. And then that question was actually really helpful for me. Now I don't need this job because I have enough. I need to think about the question. Maybe I'm not quite there yet with the 180-degree flip of your coin.
What I'm not saying is that espousing that everyone can live a money-free existence. I'm just changing the starting position at all from this. And this is after a lot of work and focus on this in certain retreats and studying the relationship with money. It's about living a free life with or without money, rather than saying, when I have enough money, I'll do what I want to do. This idea of, if we say that a certain lifestyle is going to mean that we only take on jobs that pay this much or roles that pay this much, we box ourselves into a corner. And I'm saying if the starting position is free yourself and work on freeing yourself from that and doing what you really believe in and what you're passionate about, and the money will be the outcome. I met a chap in the local community here in Scotland when I started this decelerator on this island in Bute. He joked to me, he said, the best way on this island, the best way to become a millionaire on this island? He said, start with 2 million. This was his joke that, and there was some truth, there was something in that again, you may or may not make more or less money, but you will have your needs met. You may find yourself actually making more money and being happier and more content if you can get off this spiral, which is when I have enough money, or setting the bar of enough money, dictating what you do, flip it around, decide what it is you're going to do and what you feel you should be doing, and then your needs will be met.
Let me expand a bit on that, because I feel very torn inside, a bit irritated, a bit vulnerable. When you have a high-priced lifestyle, and you get divorced, and you have a kid that you have to fund with your ex-wife, and you are a business owner that has fluctuating income, it's not like you have a paycheck, and you want to decelerate and you want to scale down. I'm still not quite there yet. I'm going back 1.5, 2 years ago. How could I have woken up in the morning asking myself the question, what would I like to do right now? Versus, okay, Marcus, you're on a good journey, but hey, make sure you got enough money until the end of the year, because if you don't have enough money until the end of the year, you can't even divorce this person. You can't get a clean cut, and your whole life would be on an order of magnitude more stressful. So as you can tell, I'm really struggling with this notion of just fuck the money and start with the really two important things in the Ikigai, which is do what you love doing and do what you're great at. I'm struggling with that. So please help me.
Yeah. And I don't want to skew us away over in this podcast. It's a fascinating thing that I've been looking at over the last couple of years. I would just almost short circuit it to say, there's a chap called Peter Koenig Money System. He does online and offline courses around this. I did a 10-day masterclass on a variety of different things. 2 days of it were around money. He talks a lot about money and source. So that would be my short circuit thing. And he, again, would have answered, I know it sounds very difficult when I'm having a divorce, or what about my kids and things like that. But even in these, everyone will have a notional view as to what they need to survive. And he challenges that with his system. He challenges us to use a relationship with money as a diagnostic tool to understand if money is freedom to you, right? You need to probably reclaim the part of you that is not free, or if it's security, maybe there's an insecure part of you. So money is the route into understanding and reclaiming parts of your identity that you have perhaps buried and suppressed. And we're getting into the kind of pounds and pence and dollars of the money thing and what it will buy us. And what I'm trying to say is it's more a diagnostic tool into our identities and ourselves and where our insecurities lie. All of that is about freeing ourselves from these unconscious things that will narrow our identities because of a relationship with money unconsciously.
And as you said, there are various levels of consciousness, and perhaps I'm just not there yet. So let's leave it there. Tell us more about the decelerator, because I think almost everything that we've discussed here, I could see 10, 12, 15, 20 faces of executives, male, female, that I would love to send there, because it sounds exactly what they might need, not necessarily what they would look for on a weekend retreat, but tell us more what it's about and what do people usually discover there about themselves?
The decelerator, in essence, is highly emergent. So I'm trying to practice what I'm somewhat preaching on this call. I was of the view that I wanted to be really working at this purpose of business, that talking about intrapreneurs and finding other entrepreneurs and companies to change the corporate system. But I also wanted to do something in the community on the island where I grew up. And I thought these two things were pulling in different directions. And then I guess I had a realization that if I could find a space and create a space on this island where people could decelerate, where I could almost awaken dormant change makers and intrapreneurs and companies, then what I wanted to do in the community and what I wanted to do in the wider world were more aligned. And then a piece of land became available, a derelict farm. I bought it. And this is really just, again, I think so many things in our life are just taking small, decisive actions and then letting things emerge. I found that certainly when it came to the whole story around the book and the non-profit business and what I was doing at Accenture. That came from a phone call. That came from reading an article in a Financial Times one day in 1999. And that small decision changed my life. It's the butterfly flaps its wings and a monsoon happens on the other side of the world. The decelerator was buying a piece of land 2 years ago that then has brought a whole cast of characters have gravitated around this idea. It's almost like Cirque du Soleil type characters meet business. And it's really an initiative that sits at the nexus between business, the arts, nature, well-being, which is, and social change. And my sense is that in that nexus is where we're going to create the change makers, getting people to identify and change themselves and then transplanting them back into the system with a deeper level of consciousness, with more engagement, more motivation to change themselves, but change the system from inside. I thought it was all going to be physical on the island. We've got to go virtual with the current pandemic, and that's worked remarkably well, I'm pleased to say. We're also going in-house into companies and bringing the cast of performers into companies. I see us having residencies where people can not just do the co-work or the we work that you have in cities, but actually be working in an environment that is conducive to innovation, creativity, and well-being every day. Wouldn't that be fantastic? So where it goes, I can't tell you. But the direction of travel is set. I may be bankrupt as a result of it, but it's what wants to emerge and what I need to be doing at the moment. So that's deceleration.
Wonderful. And I'll definitely put it in the show notes. It's a fascinating project. This is how I met the very first podcast guest, actually, Katharina Moser. She was on one of these online sessions I can really recommend. Yeah, rounding this up, what is your advice to people that work in the corporate world, business executives, vice presidents, marketing, high potentials, the people that you've been working with and were surrounded with for decades? So based on where you are right now at your level of consciousness and where you see, obviously it's a vast continuum of people, but what would be your advice? If you had a billboard, what would it say and what would be the message to people?
Festina lenti, which my mother was an English teacher who did Latin, and she said this to me a lot of my life. It means hasten slowly. Hasten slowly. This notion that we can actually go faster and further by slowing down and operating from a more conscious state of being in some ways, that we can still achieve whatever we want to achieve and more by slowing down. The sports car has an accelerator pedal, but it also has a brake pedal. And we need to get that balance right. We need to build in the mass space, the intentional space for the possibilities to emerge. And that just lets go of all the dogma and all the stories that we've been programmed with about what will make us happy and successful, if we can get back to that essence. So I'm not saying this from a person of, I've cracked the code, it's perfect, everything is right. I'm coming at this from a work in progress, and this is how what I feel just now, and this is what is much a message to myself as it is to anybody else, but this is the direction that I'm on.
Well, these were very wise words, at least in my ears, and you are certainly a role model to me. Thank you very much for your wisdom, for your energy, for your presence, for your challenge, and for your time. So thank you very much, Gib. I wish you a great week.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Marcus. Thank you.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I certainly found the point to not make your income the starting point challenging for said reasons. And now, 2 months later, and with a bit more financial runway, I am still projecting how many days of consulting I need to sell to break even or to not draw from that runway. But I'm a bit more relaxed about it. I deeply know I'll be okay and that I'll have my needs met. And the universe has my back. And it has yours, no matter what your circumstances. And so here's my call to action for this episode. If you are an employee in an organization and you think your employer could do better as a corporate citizen, whether that's its ecological footprint, diversity and inclusion, equal pay for women, to fight poverty, or anything you think would make this company a better force for good, talk to someone you trust or write an email to all employees, including the CEO, and advocate what change you'd like to see. And this is crucial, tell them what microshifts you have already made in this context so that you have moral credibility to be a leader on this topic. Leadership is to go where others haven't been. Like this employee at Microsoft who wrote that email to Satya Nadella, the CEO. You are more important than you think because you only really need one follower. It is the first follower who turns a lone nut into a leader, as Derek Sivers once famously said in the YouTube video called Leadership Lessons from a Dancing Guy. Yes, a dancing guy. And Google that as a second call to action for today. You won't regret this, I promise. It's insightful and hilarious. As I often say, change starts with you and in the here and now. So let's do something now. And the more of you listeners take action as a result of this episode, the less we go back to normal. There is one more thing, guys. If you do like this podcast, please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, which currently is the only platform where I can receive direct feedback from you. This will help me a lot to improve the quality of these episodes. And while I'm on the subject, I will rebrand Not Back to Normal into Audacify. Think Audacity and Shopify, and you get the drift. And on this note, I'll catch you soon. Thank you.